When we first turn UCS on, it asks us for an administrative password, and we can use that to log into the system. Username admin, password what we provide. But now that it's online, am I supposed to share that admin password with everybody in my organization? Usually it's best practice if we restrict access to UCS Manager by creating additional user accounts. By the end of this nugget, we're going to understand how to create additional locally authenticated users, and also how to integrate into maybe existing Radius, TACACS, or LDAP servers as well. We want to find ourselves on the Admin tab of UCS Manager, and from there we'll expand User Management. Now before we get into remote authentication, what about local authentication? What if we wanted to add another local user? We don't have Radius or TACACS set up. Well, for that we'll want to expand User Services and take a look at locally authenticated users. Here we see the admin account that Cisco UCS created for us when it was first turned on. And so we can right click here and say create a user. And from here we can enter a login ID, maybe like Jeff K. From there, we'd enter a password and select the appropriate role. So that's how we'd configure a local authentication account. How do we create the remote authentication? Well, in our example, we're going to use Radius. The same configuration principles apply for LDAP and TACACS, so we would just need to match what's already configured in the existing environment. So we'll expand Radius, and we see that there are such things as providers and provider groups. In fact, if we look at the top level here under user management and then authentication, we'll see that we need to also create a domain. So how do all these pieces fit together? Well, the word provider is really a fancy word for server. So whether that's an LDAP server, a Radius server, or a TACACS server, either way, we're going to specify the IP address or host name of a server. And so maybe 2 or 3 for redundancy. Those get added into a provider group. Now, the provider group is then specified within an authentication domain. This domain then is specified on login to determine the appropriate check, whether I'm checking against a local database, an LDAP, a Radius, TACACS, etc. So let's start by creating a Radius provider. So we'll right click and create one of these. We'll make up an IP address for this, 10.1.1.1. And the Radius key we'll specify as just being lowercase radius. And I'll make a second one. We'll say this one is 10.1.1.2. And the key again, radius, whatever the key is in this environment. All right, so now we have 2 providers. We need to add those to a provider group. So I'll right click, say Radius Provider Group. And we do have to give it a name. So Radius P for providers. And I'll hold Control and I can select both of these, click the over button, and say OK. So I have now created a group. If I look at it, we should see that I have 2 separate Radius servers or providers in this environment, and I can continue to add additional providers here if I so choose. Now we can come up to authentication and click on this, and we'll create a domain. So this domain, call it Radius D for domain, specify that this is Radius, and choose the provider group that we created. So we'll say OK. At this point, users will have the option of selecting Radius authentication when they log in. But what if we want them to have to use it via the native authentication? Well, for that, we can click on Native Authentication, which is in the tree, by the way. If we just expanded authentication, we'd see native here. And this is where we can configure the default authentication that's chosen when a user logs in. So by default, it is local, which means that it's our locally authenticated users down here, the admin account that UCS creates, or whatever locally authenticated users you've created in your environment. So we can change this now to say Radius and select the provider group that we want. And from there, we can say Save Changes. And we successfully modified the native authentication, which means next time we log into UCS Manager, we'll be using Radius. Changing the default login is really best practice for any UCS environment. We don't want to go around handing out the admin password to everybody. So at a minimum, we'd want to create new locally authenticated users for the various techs that are going to be logging into UCS Manager. Now, if we already have Radius or TACACS, we would want to create those servers as providers within UCS. We would then want to create a provider group and apply those to a domain that we'll authenticate against when we log into the GUI. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.